We're here with History Happy Hour, and I'm Rick Beyer, and who's this?
Chris Anderson.
I feel like Ed Murrow calling Chris Anderson in London. In London. And it's coming through, but okay. Chris Anderson. And Chris, what is your cocktail for History Happy Hour?
My cocktail is a lovely 12-year-old Glenfiddich, courtesy of Paul Woodage. So thanks, Paul.
Oh, awesome. And I have an Abbe, I can't get it on here. So
there you go.
An Abbe Left.
Right. Oh.
And I have a mug. Oh, gosh. It's woo,
Make sure I'll pour that on your computer. Right?
This is happening live. And happening on my lap. And I got a pewter mug to match the mug in our logo. Because, Chris, we have a logo.
That's very exciting.
Let's check it out. History Happy Hour. And we want to thank Lauren Kennedy for making that logo for us. So that was awesome, Lauren. Thank you so much. So now we'll hide that logo and go back to you and I. I mean, we're experimenting with all sorts of visuals today, cocktails and visuals. And I wanted to just absolutely, Doreen says that should be Left Brun, and Left Brun is actually better than regular Left. This is only the second best beer.
Oh, Neil, Spitfire. I like that. Good choice.
Okay. But hey, guys, post a picture of your cocktails if you can, or definitely post and tell us what your cocktail is, because that might be a whole far more interesting information stream going on your screen right there. But Chris and I are going to talk about the stories of D-Day today, and we just also want to mention that, and I'll put it up here in the bottom of the screen once Chris starts talking, that we have an email now for History Happy Hour. So if we don't get to feedback or stuff that you've posted online, you can email us at, it's very complex, but you can probably get this, HHH for History Happy Hour at StephenAmbroseTours.com.
Yep.
And we'll put that up on the screen. So our topic is stories of D-Day. And Chris, why don't you start out, because I know that you have a particular unsung or perhaps undersung D-Day hero who you're very interested in. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah. So for those of you who've traveled with me before, you know that I've mentioned this man quite a bit. But one of the unsung heroes, call him the architect of overlord, that I admire very greatly, is General Frederick Morgan. He is the British officer who plans D-Day, or what becomes D-Day. He was a relatively obscure general officer. That wouldn't be him, though.
That's not him.
That's not him, though. But he's very
mislabeled folks. See, the kinks are still being worked out, ladies and gentlemen.
While Rick is sorting that out, as you know, Freddie, British officer, he graduates from Woolwich, joins the Royal Artillery, serves with great distinction during the First World War. He's mentioned in dispatches a few times. Importantly for his story going forward, he serves with colonial troops, so he's used to coalition warfare. Stays in the army after the war, spent some time in India, and at the start of, well, I should say leading up to World War II, he's kind of appalled by the state of the British military as the Nazis are coming to power and kind of, raising alarm bells all over that nobody's listening to. And he will eventually be sent to France with the BEF. He's with 1st Armored Division, but he almost has no equipment, so he's involved in that. Involved in the retreat through France, and then is in England, and he's going to have a variety of postings in Great Britain, and he will eventually, in March of '43, be tapped to come to London. He reports to Alan Brooke, and Alan Brooke hands him basically a file of after-action reports from Commando raids, and he's told, you need to plan. There you go. That's Freddie.
Freddie Morgan.
You need to plan the largest operation in military history. You need to plan for the liberation of France. You may have 100 divisions eventually, but we can't be sure of that. We don't know where. We don't know when. We don't know who the commander is going to be. And Brooks' final words are, it's not going to work, but you have to make it look like it's going to work. So yeah.
So we don't know anything, but you have to plan it, not
Right.
knowing what your resources are. And by the way, if I can, I will avoid using your plan.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So with that resounding endorsement, he sets out. He goes to a place called Norfolk House, and he says later that it's a good thing that whoever had been there before left a pad of paper and a pencil, because when I got there with my driver, there was nothing. That was it, just us. And they set out planning. So it's going to be Morgan that picks Normandy. It's going to be Morgan that suggests 3 beaches first, because that's what he thinks he's going to have the troops to do. He's going to decide to pick airborne forces, or the need to deploy them. And he's also going to say, based on Britain's earlier accident at Dieppe, that we're not going to be able to seize a port, so we're going to have to take one with us. Kind of the termination of Mulberry. He gets involved in Operation Fortitude, which is the planning to deceive the Germans. He's involved in everything. As he's getting close to presenting his plan to the combined chiefs of staff, he gets a note from Churchill, and he's told, we don't really want to invade France. We want to continue fighting up through Italy. So, but we know that the Americans really want this. So what we want you to do is we want you to present your plan in such a way that it clearly won't work, so that we can then say, well, sorry, we tried. France won't work, but here's this great plan we have for Italy. Now, Morgan, again, he's kind of been, this has been thrust on him. He's a British officer. He served in the British Army his whole career. He's trained, and he's just been given not necessarily an order, but a heavy suggestion from the Prime Minister about what he wants Morgan to do. And Morgan, to his everlasting credit, tips off the Americans. He says that I, at this point, am commanding an Allied operation, and as an Allied officer, I'm duty bound to let the Americans know what one of their partners is doing. So that when Marshall and Brooke and all the senior commanders get together to talk about what they want to do, Marshall's ready, and he can basically undo every argument that the British make about winning in France or continuing the fight in Italy. So he not only creates the plan or begins the plan, he saves the plan. And there's a wonderful moment, I've told many of you about this, but in Suffolk House, which is Admiral Ramsay's headquarters on D-Day, and where the large invasion map that some of you have seen is, where Eisenhower is watching the news coming in. On that morning of the invasion, everybody's watching the invasion map. They're waiting to see what's going to happen, and it's crowded, but Eisenhower is kind of standing alone. And all of a sudden, in the back of the room, it's smoke-filled. People can hear, excuse me, pardon me, excuse me. Somebody's trying to get through a crowd. And a man in a rumpled battle dress, which is just kind of a fatigue sort of uniform, not a full dress uniform. Yep, there's the map right there. Comes up from behind Eisenhower and taps him on the shoulder. And they said that Eisenhower spun around, and he had this great glower, scowl on his face. And then he saw that it was Morgan, and his eyes lit up and got a big smile. And Morgan stuck out his hand and said, well, sir, congratulations, you did it. Just wanted to say good job. And Eisenhower said something to the effect of, well, Freddie, I should be thanking you. You started it. So I think that's a pretty magic moment. So I think Morgan is somebody that we should pay a lot more attention to.
Wow. Yeah. So, and then what happens to him after the war?
Well, so I mean, Morgan at that point he is the chief of staff to the Supreme Allied Commander when he's planning it. Once Eisenhower comes on board, Eisenhower is very grateful to Morgan, but he wants Beadle Smith, who's been on his staff for a while, to be his chief of staff. So Morgan becomes Beadle Smith's chief of staff, and he'll serve for the rest of the war in that capacity at SHAEF headquarters. He very often gets used to smooth over differences or arguments between British and American officers. And I think it's appropriate that at the surrender ceremony in Reims,
he's there.
He's there. He's at the end of the table, but Eisenhower makes a point of saying he should be at the table.
Wow.
After the war, he gets a job with United Nations Relief Association, and that's the organization that's bringing, leaving trucks and jeeps and bringing supplies to help rebuild Europe. He sees that it's become a front for the Soviet Union, and very correctly, but and politically makes that point and says you're just a front for the communists, and he's asked to retire, and then he becomes for a short while head of Britain's nuclear program, and he will that'll be his last public post. But once he's made that decision to basically tip off the Americans, he's done in the British Army. Montgomery says something, paraphrasing a bit, he said that Morgan considered Eisenhower somewhere on the celestial plane and me several degrees in the opposite direction. So, of course, once Montgomery becomes chief of the Imperial General Staff after the war, Morgan's not going to go anywhere.
Well, one of the things that, so I think it's so cool that there's so many stories, 75 years out, and I know the various historians who we know, you keep discovering stories, you keep finding things out, and it's fascinating. I want to thank everybody who continues to join us here for History Happy Hour, and I hope you have a good cocktail with you for this. Scott and Michael and Catherine and Carl and Chip and Neil and everybody else who's signing in here to let us know that they're here. We thank you. And I want to also say, if we touch on something that you have another question on and you want to ask about, you can email us. Did I get the email?
Look at that.
At HHH, what does that stand for?
History Happy Hour.
There we go. History Happy Hour at StephenAmbroseTours.com. It is the power and glory might be starting to get to us. So I wanted to talk about somebody. Pardon? Yes. Somebody, George, much lower on the totem pole, but also kind of an interesting and perhaps little known, certainly little known person who kind of connects a couple of different dots for me, because he was a Dartmouth professor, and I went to Dartmouth, but he also has a Ghost Army connection, but there's also a big D-Day connection. And his name is Wentworth Eldridge. In fact, his full name is Hannaford Wentworth Eldridge. So you're not surprised he went to Dartmouth. But he
Are you sure that's him?
I am sure that that's him.
Right.
And I know who the other person was who I said was Freddie Morgan, too. It's just not Freddie Morgan. So. But is that really you?
Well, I wish it wasn't, but I'm afraid it is. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Went Eldridge is a Dartmouth professor when Pearl Harbor happens, and he, like a lot of people, quits his job or takes a leave of absence, and he's going to go be part of the war effort, and he's commissioned an officer in the Air Force. And he arrives, he's shipped out to London with a kind of a headquarters type job. And he arrives in London in 1943, and he has a classic sort of first night in London American officer experience. He and two other officers who've just arrived crash a wedding at a posh British club and pick up a couple of young women at this British club, and then they all go shooting off in a taxi to a nightclub.
Are these posh women of loose virtue?
Pardon?
Are these posh women of easy virtue?
Perhaps. Well, one of the women is named Diana Lepore Trench. That's her married name because she is, in fact, married at this time, although that doesn't seem to matter much to anybody in the story. And so they go dancing into the wee hours of the morning at the 400 Club, which was a club in London. Yeah. And then when Eldridge settles down to a very boring job, he becomes the historian for the 8th Air Force. He doesn't like it very much. But it turns out that this young woman he met on the first night, Diana, her stepfather is a muckety-muck in the British military deception effort, part of the London controlling station that's controlling British deception efforts. He's also a best-selling British author named Dennis Wheatley, not well known in America, but well known in England. And it's coming up. They're getting to be about 6 months before D-Day, and he is trying to make sure that they're going to have to be working with Americans on this big deception they're doing, Operation Fortitude. And so he wants to make sure that there's somebody among the Americans who's like smart enough to deal with and that he feels like he can trust. And so he's sort of trying to see if he can suggest someone. And so he says to his stepdaughter, Diana, do you know any bright Americans who can keep their mouths shut? Literally word for word what he said. And she said, well, yeah, I do know one. And so that is exactly how Wentworth Eldridge becomes part of the Allied deception effort because of the girl that he met his first night in London.
Well, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yes.
You gotta say, he looks way too studly to be a professor. That's kind of.
Well, and if you read, if you read, so let's look at him and not us.
There we go. Come on,
quick, you can take notes on all sorts of good stuff. So he's. And if you read his unpublished autobiography, which I have been delving into for an article I'm writing, he is definitely considers himself a kind of a play the field kind of guy at this point, but he ends up with Diana at the end of the story. So, but he ends up going to work. He's one of 3 officers who are coordinating Fortitude on the American side. And one of my favorite stories involving this is that one of his first jobs is he is providing information that's going to be fed to Garbo. So Garbo, as many people will know, is one of the German agents who's been turned by the British. In Garbo's case, he kind of volunteered to become a British agent. So the Germans think he's their agent, but he's really a double agent. That's a double-cross system. And so Went Eldridge is trying to come up with information that they can feed the Garbo that sounds true but isn't, or is true but it's not important. And he is doing this, but he's very skeptical of whether or not this is going to make any difference. How are the Germans reacting to it? If we don't know how they're reacting, how do I know what to say? And he kind of makes some noise going upstairs. And he's ordered to report to this colonel. And the colonel's name is Telford Taylor, who later becomes a prosecutor at Nuremberg. But he goes in to see this colonel, and the colonel very theatrically draws the curtains in the room, and he says, Eldridge, if you repeat what I'm going to tell you, you will be shot. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Eldridge responded. And he tells him about Bletchley Park and the breaking of the Enigma code, and he introduces him to Ultra, the German intelligence. And so that he became, is it bigoted? Is that the word? If you are privy to the very top secret ultra intelligence that we're reading from the Germans. And he's the only one of the American deception planners before D-Day who's privy to the ultra. And Eldridge's comment was, upon learning about this, was, well, I better stop drinking.
And hanging out with loose women at clubs.
And B, I hope I don't talk in my sleep was the second one. Anyway, there's a whole bunch more about Went Eldridge, but that's an introduction. And interesting, as I said, I'm writing an article about this for the Dartmouth Alumni Magazine. And interesting is that Diana also ends up going to work for the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. And so she has some interesting experiences there, and that's kind of part of the story as well. So again, sort of people big and small, even before we get to the beaches, who you don't know as part of D-Day.
You ever wonder though if he came back to Dartmouth at the end of the war?
He did.
So he goes through all of this hair-raising stuff, lives through the Blitz, secret agent man, and he comes back and he's got to put up with snot-nosed kids like you to teach you about Western Civ.
He very intelligently retired the summer before my freshman year. So I never met him. So that was a sadness for me. And then he got a contract to write up a history of the American side of deception and had a stroke the following year. And so he survived the stroke and he lived for another 15 years and he wrote his autobiography, but he never kind of wrote the sort of detailed, well-researched history of the American side of deception that he wanted to write.
Yeah.
So,
that's great.
Interesting guy. But after all that stuff, he and his wife said they wanted to live on a hilltop and hide from the world. And that's pretty much what they did.
A lot of that going around.
Yeah. Welcome to quarantine, everybody. So And we should say hi to Brian Peacock and Eric Flint and Ted Moon and Lisa. Lisa really just wants to say hi to George.
Yeah, I know.
And Cindy. And my sister Catherine says that she's perhaps giving her away her age there, but she says most of the professors who taught right after World War II were teaching returned soldiers. Well, she's not talking about her professors. She's talking about my dad. My dad was a professor in that period, although he was not a soldier in World War II. But many of his colleagues were at D-Day and had fascinating stories.
Well,
D-Day.
D-Day. Well, I mean, the topic of people that we should know more about. We hear the name, but somebody else I'd like to bring up is Bertram Ramsay, Admiral Ramsay. Again, most people have heard of him because they've read the caption in a book and it says, "Oh, that's the Navy guy next to Eisenhower." British people, English people certainly know who he is, but I don't think most Americans really give him much thought. And he's another one of these guys who, I said the man matches the moment, but you wouldn't have expected him there. He's born into a very, very important family, born in Hampton Court, there we go, Palace, and very well connected. He joins the Royal Navy. He's commissioned in the Royal Navy just before the First World War. And he has command of basically torpedo boats, the World War I equivalent of a PT boat, on the Dover station and up around Belgium. And he does that well enough that by 1917 he is given command of a destroyer. And as a destroyer officer, he will take part in the Zeebrugge raid and other raids as the Allies try to get around the trenches and get back behind the Germans. Doesn't work out, but he spends a lot of time on the Dover station. And he serves there after the war in a variety of posts. And I should say Dover station is going to be that part of the channel which is going to be most involved in World War II. So Calais, Dover, that whole area there, the shortest part of the channel, that's going to be his area of responsibility. And he is there when in 1940, when Dunkirk and the evacuation happens. So kind of the reason he struck me as somebody I had mentioned on this show is he's got a connection to Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, which I've also been kind of getting ready for in the hope that tour will happen. But he's there, and it's important to remember that up to this point, he's moderately successful in the Navy, but he's by no stretch a leading light. He's just another admiral. One of the things I said that was very interesting about him is early in his career, he didn't necessarily go for those postings that would have brought him acclaim or progression. They said he focused an awful lot on logistics and staff work. Not very sexy, but kind of important. So he has this background, which has meant for most of his career, it's not going to take him very far, but is going to prepare him for that moment that nobody could imagine was going to happen, and that is the evacuation of Allied forces from France after the German invasion. And so it's from his headquarters at Dover Castle that he is going to plan Operation Dynamo, which is the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk. And largely through his efforts, 338,000 Allied soldiers, French, British, Polish, Czech, you name it, are evacuated from Dunkirk. So the reason there is an army, a British army, at the end of all that is because of Ramsay. And I should say, like I said before, I should have mentioned if I haven't, before the war, he had retired in 1938, and Churchill actually brings him back as a temporary position when he has this. So he's there, he stays on Dover, and he's there during that period leading up to the Battle of Britain. He's there, during that, commanding the Dover station. He gets involved in a lot of the naval actions there, and then he is going to be, because he's planned this evacuation Operation Dynamo, which logistically is so tricky, he will get involved in the planning for the invasion of North Africa, and then later the landings at Sicily. So much like Eisenhower, he comes from relative obscurity through circumstance, but also ability and skill. He's the man that you need to command naval forces, the largest, most complex naval operation ever planned.
He just keeps doing landing after landing. So
correct.
He's his skill all the way along.
Right, and so he builds on us. There's I saw somebody had posted a question. I want to make sure I see where it went. But somebody, Mike mentions that during the course of the planning of for all of this, he had a somewhat tense relationship with some of the American admirals. He did not get along well with a lot of the American admirals assigned to the Overlord plan. And he conflicted with Admiral King quite a bit, who commanded, of course, U.S. naval forces. So there was a lot of argument, politicking, and what have you. But he's another one of those guys, much like Eisenhower, who said, this has to work. If this doesn't work, the consequences are we don't even want to think about. I was rereading an interview with one of the women who worked on his staff, and they said he was very austere and very committed. Wasn't very warm and fuzzy. They said that, but he trusted his work. He's trusted his people. So they said that he would go off and plan big things and think deep thoughts, give the order, and then let his subordinates do it. So he commands, obviously, the Normandy landings go as they should have. And he will be one of the people that is whispering in Eisenhower's ear and basically screaming at Montgomery saying, you have to take the Scheldt estuary, because we've talked about as the Allied armies advance across Europe, there's that debate about single front, single thrust, broad front, the whole market garden thing. We'll get to that later. And Montgomery takes Amsterdam, but doesn't take the Scheldt estuary, which means you can't use the port. Can't use the port. Eisenhower has to have it. Big consequences. Maybe we'll do something about that later. And then, so he's off going toe-to-toe with Montgomery. And then in January of 1945, he is flying to meet with Montgomery because despite his rank, of course, Montgomery doesn't go to meet anybody. You have to come meet Monty.
Famously.
Yeah. So he boards a plane to go fly just outside of Paris. He's flying to Brussels to meet with Montgomery, and the plane crashes and he's killed. So, because of that, he never writes his memoirs, and we don't really get his side of the things. And I think what that means is maybe a little bit the naval side of the D-Day landings that get talked about.
Yeah.
And also, we as Americans don't really know that much about him. He's not really kind of part of our consciousness because of that, and because he didn't get along well with King. So I think he's just somebody else we should maybe take a second look at.
Was there anybody who got along well with Admiral King?
Mrs. King?
King is the guy who said, when the going gets tough, they send for the sons of bitches. And he's another one. He was one of the sons of bitches they sent for. The rumor was that he shaved with a blowtorch. He was kind of a hard ass, I think.
Yeah, and I think, when you're talking about Ramsay and Eisenhower, they said that, Eisenhower just had this charm and he could kind of win people over. And the impression I get of Ramsay is he wasn't that at all. But he was just damn good at his job and people had faith in him. And again, they said he was very austere, but they respected him. And obviously, he planned D-Day, so hard to argue with that.
Yeah, and when you read up about Operation Neptune, the amount of detail in it, and when you stand there and just try to take in the detail in that map in Suffolk House of Operation Neptune, it's really, really quite extraordinary. I want to just call out. Carl says, Chris, turn on a desk lamp and come out of the shadows. We're working on Chris's lighting. You know, a lighting team will be flying to London later
Sure.
this week to try to fix that.
I've got one of these like little portable things I can.
You'd have to. It needs to be on your face, Chris. This is what you're missing. Why don't you try holding it here? And I'm sure that's a great look.
It's like a horror movie, yeah. The Shining, the History Shining.
Yes. That's you can start your own show. The History Shining. Again, welcome to History Happy Hour. Thank God we're halfway through. You don't have to put up with that much more of it. And thanks to everybody who's joined us. And we're talking about some stories of D-Day. And let's get to D-Day. I mean, we've done the planning and everything, getting ready for it. So getting to actual D-Day, I want to tell a story about the Rangers and Pointe du Hoc. Oh, my God, Chris Anderson.
My technical department just came in and fixed the light.
My wife just handed me a note, but I mean it's right. The offstage support here is awesome, and
your technical support and my technical, they're thinking the same thing.
They're thinking they're going to take over next week.
Hey, Fred.
I want to tell a story about a guy, and I realized about halfway through my preparations for this week that I was going to come in for an enormous amount of ribbing for the fact that this is also a person with a Dartmouth connection.
Oh!
Okay. But it's a very interesting story. So last year, for the 75th anniversary, I did a private tour for a few days, right up to D-Day. And the woman who was on this tour said, we want to visit Pointe du Hoc because my uncle was at Pointe du Hoc. And I said, well, okay, what was his name? And she said, well, his name was Ted Lapris. And I said, okay, well, I will see if I can find out anything about Ted Lapris and include that when we go visit Pointe du Hoc. And Ted Lapris turned out to be a really, really interesting person. Here he is.
Hey, I've seen him before.
Not Freddie Morgan. And Ted Lapris was a Dartmouth 42. He was a three-sport guy, football, hockey, lacrosse, I think. Volunteers, ends up in the Rangers. Obviously a tough guy, not a big, huge guy, probably 5'9", packed a lot of muscle. But Ted Lapris was a lieutenant, and he was the first officer up the bluff when the Rangers took Pointe du Hoc. And people may remember that this was kind of considered a very difficult assignment, that all the way at the edge, sort of past the edge of Omaha Beach, that the Rangers have to take this gun position at Pointe du Hoc. They have to climb up these 40, 50-foot cliffs to get to the top where the Germans are firing down upon them. They shoot grappling hooks and climb up the cliffs to take it. And it's really one of the extraordinary moments of D-Day. And of course, Ronald Reagan, very famously in 1984, referenced the boys of Pointe du Hoc in his speech on the 40th anniversary. And many people have visited there. I'm actually told, I saw Paul Woodage said that they've restricted access a little bit.
Yeah, they put lots of fencing up now.
Paths and stuff, so you can't do everything you used to. But Lapris was the first officer up the bluffs. He was there about 5 minutes up, and there was an enlisted man who went up in front of him, and the rope was cut. So this private actually lay down on the rope and held it, and 4 other guys came up, and Ted Lapris was one of them. He commanded a platoon in E Company of the 2nd Rangers, and his company is the one that attacked. They landed right by the observation post, right on the point, and they're the ones who attacked that observation post. And if you've visited Pointe du Hoc, you've almost certainly been in that observation post. It's the kind of the place everybody wants to visit. If you see the damage done inside there, that was done by Ted Lapris and the half a dozen people he had up with there on the cliff. And how do I know that's exactly where he came up? I actually was able to go there with this couple that I took there and stand on the spot and say, Ted Lapris came up right here. And how do I know that? And the reason I know that is that 10 years after the war, Collier's magazine did a article about Pointe du Hoc. And they went back there, a writer went back with Colonel Rudder, who commanded the Rangers. And in that article, which I found, there's a photograph, and there's Colonel Rudder with his son at that point, who's like about 10 years old.
ABMC wouldn't allow that right now.
No, they wouldn't have allowed that for the last 30 years, I think. But I don't know if you can read the caption there. He says, there's still a rope here. It's part of it's cut off. But he says in the caption, that's where Lapras came up. And I just defined that, and then to be able to go and stand on the spot with his niece and say, that's where Ted Lapras, you are standing at the spot that he came up. It was very emotional, and it was a very, it's not that he did anything any more spectacular than the other Rangers, but it's always great to be able to put a personal face to it and a personal story to it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And he, and a lot of people don't know, I suspect that much of our audience here knows, but many people, when they think of Pointe du Hoc and the casualties the Rangers suffered, most of them are not, in fact, making that awful climb up the bluffs. As terrifying as that is, I think they took 1 killed and 15 wounded,
right,
something like that coming up. Their casualties come in the next 48 hours as they move across the road, and they're trying to hold a position and block the road to the Germans, keep their position, and they're getting constant German counterattacks. And so that is one of the things that makes that kind of such a heroic stand, because I think it's 2 days before anybody comes to relieve them.
Well, and I think. Oh, I'm sorry, Rick. Go ahead. Well, that was interesting. No, it was the ghost army behind you. He's creeping up on you now.
Oh, keep in mind, I can cut your picture off at any time. Oh, we're having a problem with Chris's sound. I'm so sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you're talking about Pointe du Hoc, and you were talking about how they suffer more casualties defending the point than getting to the point. And that's one of those misconceptions. One of the other misconceptions, I think, is that maybe because of the movie, I don't know, but we focus on the guns that were there or not there, as the case may be. But really, the more I look at that story, what strikes me as important about what Lapras and Lamel and all the Rangers do is they act as a speed bump between Grand Camp and Omaha Beach, Verville. I mean, if they're not there, there's lots of Germans that can come reinforce the Germans that are trying to protect the Verville draw. We all know that things aren't going really well for the 29th Division there at the start of the landing. So I think that's another little component of the story that should probably maybe get a little bit more play.
So I'll finish up with a little bit on Ted. He about a month after D-Day, he steps on a landmine near Cherbourg, and which he survives. I want to quickly say, but the Army, he's one of the few people I've been able to get his full Army record from, because a lot of those records were burned in the fire in '75. And the Army has a phrase for this. They said he had a traumatic amputation, or as Lapras said, he blew his foot off.
Right. As opposed to a mild, slightly off-putting amputation.
Yeah. And he was in the hospital, and his commanding officer wrote a letter to his mother. And I want to, this isn't Rudder, this is Captain Dick Merrill. I'm not sure if it was his commander or his colleague, but he wrote a letter to Lapras' mother on July 28th after he'd had surgery and they knew he was going to make it. Please be assured, though, that Ted won't be handicapped either physically or mentally. During his stay in the hospital here, he was full of fun and continually cracking jokes, his usual self. One thing you don't know about is the great respect the men he led in combat have for him. In the Army, we call what he had guts, and his men state freely that they never knew anyone who had more than he did, which is a pretty good tribute. And he goes on, he goes to law school at Cornell, and he's there at Cornell, and he's got 1 foot, right? He's got 1 foot and a prosthetic. But he goes to the coach of the hockey team at Cornell and says, "Can I skate with your team?" Okay, I'll let the crippled veteran come in and skate with the team. A week later, the coach had his head in his hand. He said, "I wish I had one player who could skate as well and play as well as you can." So the one-legged guy was skating circles around the rest of the Cornell hockey team. I think Ted Lapras was a tough dude.
That's great. So. Well, I mean, I have another kind of special operation I wanted to talk to. But before I do, Robert had asked about a good book on Admiral King, and
watch this, Chris. Check this out.
Oh,
Look at that.
there you go.
Right, we're learning stuff every moment here.
You man, I'm just gonna sit back and watch you.
This is a blast.
And Mike has spoke up and pointed out he's right. There you go. The Admirals has a lot about King, so check that out. And you might also, if you've been on the Pacific trip or interested in that, obviously King looms pretty large in that story. So maybe we'll get to him a little bit later on another show if people still want to watch. But along the line, similar to what Rick was saying about Lampers and Pointe du Hoc, another one of those little actions, again, that lots of English people, French people know about, but we as Americans don't, is the actions of 47 Royal Marine Commando at Port-en-Besson. For those of you who don't know or aren't aware, Port-en-Besson is the junction point between the British and the American sectors of the beaches. If you've traveled to Normandy, it's kind of that in that dead ground that you go through when you've just left the American cemetery and you're driving really quickly to get to Pegasus Bridge, and you go down by the British beaches and you go to Armagh. It's in between the two beaches. And we just kind of drive by it and don't think about it. But that was a D-Day objective for a couple of reasons. One was that it had been designated as the place that was going to be used to pump fuel across from England. You may have heard of the underwater pipeline that was going to come out there. Also, fuel stores brought across the channel by ship were going to be stored there and then sent on. It was felt at the time that it wasn't large enough for a major logistics spot, but it eventually becomes important. It's also critically important because Montgomery had talked about maybe somewhere in that area setting up his first CP on French soil. But most importantly is the junction point between the two sectors. Again, it's great to land at these individual beaches, but unless you can link them all up, the invasion's not going to stick. So you have to have somebody land. So the job is going to go to 47 Royal Marine Commando, 14 landing craft, 30 men on a landing craft. They're going to come in at 7:30 at the rightmost flank of Gold Beach, and then they're going to basically land behind the Gold Beach forces, hook a right, go behind the German gun battery at Long-sur-Mer, which is that big battery that many people visit on the trip with the guns and the casemates and what have you, and get into Port-en-Besson that first day. Well, it doesn't really work out that way. As they're coming ashore, they wind up getting basically misdirected, being brought into the wrong landing spot, and their commander makes the decision to turn all the landing crafts broadside to the beaches to bring his guys to the right spot, kind of similar to what happens to Rudder with the Rangers. They land very late. They land where they go is an area that hasn't been swept very adequately for mines. And so they begin to suffer casualties as they get to shore. And then they have a 12-mile hike behind enemy lines to get to their objective. And they spend the 6th just trying to get to Port-en-Besson. And they get to a piece of high ground just outside of the port when darkness comes. So they're stopped there. And just so if you can't picture it, Port-en-Besson is flanked on either side by 200-foot cliffs. Right. The itself sits down kind of in this crack between the two. The Germans have resistance nests on each of the pieces of high ground. They called it the west side, the east side, and then on the south side. And so the commandos are going to have to advance into this. In the course of the failed landing and their travel overland, they've used an awful lot of their supplies and equipment. They've gotten shot up very, very well. It's one of the instances you read about very infrequently, but happens here, where they actually pick up German weapons and supplies as they're fighting across country because they have nothing else. But early that next morning, they're going to begin to attack. They attack into the town. They get involved in this incredibly nasty fight, house-to-house fighting in the town of Pointe du Hoc. And then they have to take the high ground on either side. One party begins to go up the western bluffs, western side of the town, and they're then taking fire from Germans on the eastern side of the eastern position, and also two flak boats, Kriegsmarine flak boats that fire up on these guys. So there's a Lieutenant Cousins who will eventually basically find, they call it up the zigzag path, but he finds a way up the eastern side of the defenses with just a handful of guys, 25 guys to start. He gets to the top, and there's a series of bunkers up there, and they're all still up there, which is another nice thing.
Yeah.
You can see where the fighting was. But he kind of tries to get the high ground, fails a couple times. Eventually, he will basically stand up and lead a charge with 4 guys behind him. They said that everybody had their helmets on except for Cousins. He had his green beret on. He's unfortunately killed by a German grenade, but they take the position. And then once they have that, then they can bring fire, support the troops on the other side of town, and they're eventually able to take the town. So that eventually it's going to be troops from the 16th Infantry Regiment finally advancing from Omaha Beach that are going to link up with them. And that's where the British and the American sectors will finally join up. But in the course of doing all of that, they're going to suffer about 50% casualties. And 47 Commando will continue to fight. After that fight, they get sent to the left flank of the landings, and they're going to be thrown in to help British Airborne as they're holding that left flank of the penetration against all those armor attacks.
Up by Pegasus Bridge.
Yeah, exactly. And they get shot up pretty good. Continue. They're involved in operations up till the end of the war, and on VE Day of the 420 guys that land on June 6th, there are 88 left with the Commando by the end. So again, there are lots of stories like this, but again, it struck me as, well, one of the things that struck me was it's a nationalities thing, but there are just so many things that we as Americans don't know about D-Day, and little stories that we should be maybe more aware of. I thought, it was interesting.
And there's so many stories that get told over and over and over.
Right.
And not that they're some of them are really good stories and worth telling.
Absolutely.
But there's stories that are whether it's of heroism or thinking about Freddie Morgan and thinking about Bertram Ramsay and sort of saying, whatever the politics, I'm going to do what's right because it's a life or death situation, and you don't really you can't indulge in the politics. I think that's all stuff that's really good and important to remember.
Well, and I think the other thing is, and I mentioned this to you, I mentioned it on all my tours, one of the things that I find so compelling about the stories are that it's proof that an individual person still has agency in these situations. It's easy when you're reading all this stuff about 150,000 men and 3,000 ships, whatever the numbers are, you can get lost in just the scale of it all. But at the end of the day, it very often is just one person. He says no or says yes. And I find it compelling and interesting, but I also find it comforting.
Well, and maybe now when we're all sitting at home, feeling a little bit lost in the whole situation that's going on right now, that's a good reminder. And the time might come where one person's actions can make some difference on, whether it's on their block or in a larger sphere. And you sort of have to wait for that moment.
Before we leave the subject, I saw a comment here from Ross. What was the 47 Commandos operation known as? I should say it was 47 Royal Marine Commandos, and it was Operation Aubrey.
Aubrey?
Yeah, Aubrey.
All right.
So that was their component of it. So if you want to look that up, and there's a very, very good book. It's called From D-Day to the Scheldt, and it's written by the Commando surgeon. He's with them for the whole war, and you get it on Amazon or online.
So in our last few minutes here, we're going to completely change the topic and change what we're doing. And you know, I should say that this was Chris's idea to begin with. So unless it works, in which case, no, I think then I'll happily take credit for it. No, I think it's a great idea. Chris said, you know, we both live. Chris lives in London. I live in Chicago. Well, we're sort of semi-housebound at the moment. We like to get out and about in our neighborhoods. And Chris said, well, we should do some sort of history around us segment, because everybody has history around us, and we can talk about ours, and then maybe other people can share some ideas that we can make part of the episode in future weeks. And this has nothing to do, at least as far as I know, Chris, with World War II.
Nothing whatsoever.
Okay, just confirming that there wasn't some weird connection here, but I'll let you go first and talk about history around us a little bit, and I've got your photos ready, so I can help you out there. And Scott, we see your question, and we'll answer you offline on that, if that's okay.
Okay. Oh,
right.
sorry.
History around us.
Yeah, no, I didn't know if you're going to put the picture up. So I go for a quick walk around the house as far as they'll let me go in my period of confinement. And so just down the street from me, you may see a white building there. It's maybe a 10-minute walk from my house. And if you saw it a little bit larger, you would see a blue plaque. There we go. The blue plaque is it was the home of Edward Elgar, who you may recognize some of his tunes.
I'm sorry. I'm doing, that's the blue plaque. Okay.
Yep.
I was looking at the wrong side.
Yep. Oh, sorry. Green plaque. But above the doorway, perhaps most famously, is Abbey Road Studios, where those four wacky kids from Liverpool recorded an album. And ever since then, traffic is really bad. If you go to the crosswalk, there's always traffic because people want to get their pictures there, and it drives drives the pedestrians crazy. So one of the sayings amongst all the people here in Maida Vale is, if you're ever late for a meeting, just throw up your hands and say, oh, I drove by Abbey Road and the damn tourists, they blocked the road, so I'm late. I'm sorry.
And there's nobody there now.
Often used excuse. So
and it's empty now.
And it's empty. So yeah, you can do laps around Abbey Road. So
there's nobody crossing there. And so it was the home of Edward Elgar, the composer.
Yes.
Composer. I have a fact correct. Always amazing. I had no idea. I did not know that part. That is very, very cool.
Yeah.
And so, all right. So I'm going to. I'm working on the graphics here, and I have something to show you, which is down the street from me, and it is I live on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. And down the street is a building which is the former studio of Chess Records. And Chess Records is at 2120 South Michigan Avenue. So it's a little less than a mile from here. It's not a big tourist spot, but it was an R&B label, and they actually had several different locations. This was their location from 57 to 65. So they have a lot of, they're very well known among R&B aficionados. And some of the R&B aficionados who really knew about and liked Chess Records was another band from England who came to the U.S. on their first tour in 1964 before they performed the song and recorded the song Satisfaction. But it was the Rolling Stones. And the Rolling Stones made a pilgrimage to Chess Records here at 2120 South Michigan Avenue. And they recorded songs here down the block from me, one of which is an instrumental, which is called 2120 South Michigan Avenue. That's the title of it. You can't find it on iTunes, but I found it, Chris. And I'm serious. This is not a joke. This is all serious. It's absolutely true. I can try to play for you if you like.
Well, please.
Let's see how it goes here. We're getting into a whole new level of. Can you hear it?
I can.
I kept the volume low so it wouldn't overwhelm us.
Now, did they go there because they couldn't get any time at Abbey Road?
I don't know, but that's the. Let's get rid of this one. All right, there we go. Got that 60s groove.
Yeah.
So that could be our credits music for today.
It could be.
History Happy Hour, brought to you by Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Hey, next week, we are going to do this again next week at the same time.
I hope so.
We hope you'll come and join us. And we're going to have at least one guest next week. We're going to invite on Yakir Katz, who is the owner of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. He's the boss, and he's got a family connection to Stephen Ambrose, and he can talk about that and how the company got started, because we know people are often interested in that. And we may have some other guests on next week too. We're starting to feel a little bit more comfortable with things, so we'll see if we can up the game a little bit.
Well, I want to say too, obviously, please send us your questions on those emails, and we'll answer them through the week. Anything you ask live, we didn't get to, shoot Rick or I an email. And since this was, can I say it was my idea since it worked out all right?
Sure.
Please, as far as your quarantine will let you go, history happens all around us. So if there's a cool spot that you can walk to with your dog on your allowed 1 hour out, go and take a picture and send it to us. Tell us a little bit about it, and we'll talk about where history happened near you.
Absolutely. I think that would be really fun and awesome.
Yeah.
And so thank you very much. This has been History Happy Hour, and we will see you next week. Appreciate it.
Same time, same bad channel.
All right.
Woo.
Now I have to mute us because they can still hear us. Or we can keep talking over the credit. This would be, people say that was the most interesting part when they kept talking.
We're going to do Mystery Science Theater. We'll play a war movie and just talk about it.
They can still hear us, if they're still there. The smart ones are still there. Thank you, Ronald. Appreciate the comment. Thank you, Brian. And Ross says, remember when HHH used to play music? Does he mean Hubert Horatio Humphrey? I'm not sure. But
Lori, please do hang in there. What'll happen?
Thank you, Gary Ann and Cindy and Lori. Really appreciate Ronald Stassen. Appreciate everything, guys. Bob, Scott. All right. Signing off for real. Farewell.